Hello, welcome. My name is Liza Oliver. I'm the director of the Pluralism Initiative and associate professor of art history. And it's a pleasure to introduce to you this evening Professor Ivan Kurilla, currently an international scholar in residence at Wellesley, where he's teaching in the political science department. Many of you here may have already had the opportunity to meet Professor Kurilla last year when he held the Cornell Distinguished Visiting Professorship with the Newhouse Center for the Humanities. He is a historian of Russian-U.S. relations and is the author of 5 books on the topic. Prior to arriving at Wellesley, Ivan was a professor at the European University at St. Petersburg, where he was fired from his position because of his vocal condemnation of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So tonight's theme of academic freedom and war in Russia is something that Professor Kurilla not only approaches as a historian, but as a person directly affected by these issues. And it bears noting as well that the topic of tonight's event is all the more salient, as just yesterday marked the 3rd anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Professor Kurilla will be in conversation this evening with Nina Tumarkin, the Kathryn Wasserman Davis Professor of Slavic Studies and Professor of History here at Wellesley. A historian of Russian history, Professor Tumarkin is the author of 2 books focusing on Russian historical memory of the Soviet past. So please join me in welcoming both Professors Kurilla and Tumarkin.
I'm really pleased and honored to be in conversation with my esteemed colleague, Ivan Kurilla. He is, to add a few luminous notes here, he is a most distinguished and prolific scholar in the fields of Russian-American relations and symbolic politics, both in Russia and elsewhere. And I should note that his most recent book, 2024 book, that has not yet been translated into English, it's titled Americans and All the Rest, The Sources and Meaning of U.S. Foreign Policy. It won a major literary prize in Russia, get this, as the best nonfiction book published in 2024 in any field. He's also a public intellectual in Russia and in emigration, with many, many media appearances and public lectures. His most, I guess in a sense, dramatic media appearance was last fall when a popular young interview of celebrities called Yuri Dudz interviewed Professor Kurilla for almost 3 hours, and to date, 4.5 million people have viewed it. I mean, that's like, I'm from New York. It's maybe 1/3 of the size of the population of New York. So it's very impressive, and we're really lucky to have him here at Wellesley. I'd like to begin with a few words inspired by or prompted by yesterday's 3rd anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. That invasion was timed actually to pretty much coincide with the previous day, which was February 23rd, Defender of the Fatherland Day, a holiday which began in 1919 as Red Army Day. And indeed, the day before yesterday, President Putin oversaw the laying of a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Moscow, dedicated to the memory of the USSR's losses in World War II, and staggering losses in World War II, which Putin early in this Russo-Ukrainian war said he was continuing that World War II fight against purported Nazis in Kiev. Recently, you surely know that words have come from Washington that Volodymyr Zelensky is a dictator who had not been elected, that Ukraine had started the war, and that Ukraine had begun this war. I'm sure you all know, but I just want to reiterate that these are blatant lies. Zelensky was democratically elected. He's a democratically elected president, and Russia began the war by launching an absolutely unprovoked invasion that turned into a totally calamitous war. Scholars in the field of Russian studies and U.S. relations, U.S.-Russian relations, and many others are appalled and distressed by Mr. Trump's evident siding with Putin and Russia in this conflict, by beginning negotiations for peace that did not include Ukraine or even Europe, by the preposterously harsh terms that the U.S. had proposed to impose on Ukraine, and by the utterly disgraceful moment yesterday at the United Nations when the United States vetoed a resolution condemning Russia for the war, which is grinding on and has ravaged so much of Ukraine. So, Professor Kurilla, will you tell us something about the war itself, any aspect that you think is most relevant to the present day, and particularly to our conversation about academic freedom in Russia?
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Tumarkin, for a kind introduction of me. And yes, it's a hard day it's a tragic day for all Ukrainians who are still suffering under the bombs. And it's also a tragic day for Russians. I mean, for those Russians who feel a responsibility, who feel that, those bombs are flying to Ukraine on behalf of like every Russian citizen, and it's still a tragedy for us, and feeling this responsibility is a hard feeling, and all of the people who are against Mr. Putin's rule and against this war, and could do nothing to prevent the war, feeling pretty uneasy in this anniversary, and then every day since the war started, for already more than 3 years by now. I would say, because we are now, we plan to speak about Russian academia, Russian society, I would say that it's the war, I cannot compare the suffering of Ukrainians under the bombs. But I could say that Russians, for the Russian people, it's also the huge blow and the huge, a huge destruction of hopes that Russia will steadily become more liberal, democratic, and free country. And what we've experienced since the beginning of the war, I mean, what Russians and Russian professors and ordinary Russians experienced since the beginning of the war was a rapid change of the state of life, of the regime, of everyday feelings, from the what political scientists will probably call authoritarian regime at the beginning, to the pure dictatorship, which started almost overnight. And that was a big change for Russians of how the war influenced the Russian society and the Russian state. And that was the big I cannot say very unexpected, but people did not want to believe that such things is possible until the very eve of the war, until the February 23 of 2022. People, even those who possessed some information, that it was not a big secret, and people, this leakage, and American intelligence published this preparation for the war, but people did not want to believe. I mean, the people could not envision that such a blatant attack on Ukraine was possible, and it's still, that's why. A big number of people emigrated. Some emigrated just a few weeks or days after the start of the war. Some attempted to stay. I myself attempted to stay as long as possible and continue to speak freely, but it was becoming more and more difficult, more and more dangerous. And finally, I can tell it maybe later in our conversation, I was fired from my university for being, and I was happy that we just fired and not arrested. just this morning I got a news from a colleague of mine, a Facebook friend, and who is a specialist on the cinema. She is a critic and teacher of movie cinema studies. She was detained this morning in Moscow, and the only guilt I know for her, she was writing in Facebook what she was thinking about the war. So it just happens like on a daily basis, and the people. And this is how and people being arrested, detained, pushed out of the work from academia and from the country, or others were intimidated by such such behavior of the state. It's finally get to the situation right now. We can the people are people keep silence. There is a resistance, but resistance is invisible. It's like a sabotage. So, on the 4th years of the war, Russian society is very different from what it was even 3 years ago. Not to speak about 10 or 15 years ago, when people still had hopes that Russia will develop into the democracy and liberal state. That's what I can say about the war and its influence on the Russian society as a whole.
Well, the latest figures that I saw this morning on Meduza and Mediazona indicate that somewhere between 160,000 and 165,000 Russian officers, soldiers, contract troops, mobilized personnel, and other fighters have been killed since February. So, February of 2022. How has Russian society reacted to these losses, these huge losses, and what do other portions of society think about the war? Do they approve of it? If yes, then why? If not, then where are the massive protests of the sort that we had during the Vietnam War?
This is a question which many scholars, sociologists, political scientists are studying during the whole war, and that's a very conflicting interpretations of how is Russian society, what it is now, and what is the state of the Russian society now. Partially because it's very hard to know, because of this pressure, because of the censorship, intimidation. It's hard to research. I mean, it's hard to know what people really think, because they would not respond openly to anybody who asks them, even to a friend, and not to say about the polling organization like Levada or whoever doing. So there are several researchers, that describe the Russian attitude to the war, and that is conflicting description. On the one hand, when the war, that's more than 100, it's maybe even much more, 100,000 people died. There are people who are relatives of those who died and friends of those who died. And some of them, not all of them, but some of them feeling that they need to ascribe to their death some noble sources. I mean, people do not want to think that their relative died for Putin's ambition or for whatever, for imperialism. They need to ascribe some noble source. So this part of the society are right now elaborate this narrative which resonates with official propaganda, because only within this narrative these people deaths are somehow was not in vain, that is, and this is part of the picture. There is also still the big portion of the population who were against the war, who still against the war, and that is a big. We can judge. We cannot judge how big this portion is, but what we know, just several days ago, the Russian State Duma adopted a legislation which banned for how they call it, for destruction of private property with symbols of the support of the special military operation, something like that. It means that they specifically want to defend those, cars which uses like Z symbol of the war by Russian propaganda or whatever from vandalizing. So it means that it is vandalized. It means that such cases are widespread if the special law demand was required. So I guess that this is at least, well, we can judge that there are people who do not like the war and they want to protest it this way by destruction or by vandalizing property of supporters. But again, we don't know how many people are doing like that. And actually getting to academia, academia is a more, I know more how people behave in academia, and we can judge. We have at least some figures and some some raw data about the academics. From the very beginning, at the very first day of the invasion of February 24, the scholars and scientists created a protest letter. And more than 8,000 people signed it within a few hours and a few days of the war. That was a protest, and I just have a quotation with me, a small one. Yeah, it is bitter to realize that our country, which has made a decisive contribution to the victory over Nazism, has now instigated a new war on the European continent. We demand an immediate halt to all military operations directed against Ukraine. We demand respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Ukrainian state. We demand peace for our countries. That was signed in the very first day and that was signed by 8,000 scholars, scientists, professors around Russia. Partially because scholars were among the last parts of the Russian society which had networks. The Putin regime in the previous decade smashed almost all the forms of the horizontal organization. There is no solidarity, no way to contact each other. But you cannot cut the scientific academic network, because it's the essence of science. So scientists had a network and they immediately did it. And there was a response to that. There was several types of response from the state. During the first weeks of the invasion, the state adopted several punitive laws against any mention of the atrocities of the Russian army, any mention of the wrongdoing, even for blaming Russians in any atrocities. The people got to jail for many years just for mentioning atrocities like Bucha or whatever. People are getting like 7-10 years in prison for mentioning it in public. And that was, in one case, even, the person went to prison because it's mentioned in the telephone conversation with a friend, and that was not friend who delivered him to authorities. The phone conversation was overheard by special services, and the person was getting to jail. And that was, it worked in some cases. Of course, not everybody are overheard, but this is listening devices in some places. And another response from the state to this letter, and actually for this resistance, was that the state forced the rectors or presidents of the universities to sign a letter to support the war. It was a kind of counterbalance. But you should know that in Russia, almost all the universities are state universities, and all the presidents or rectors of the universities are state employees. They can be fired just overnight for no reason, and they are actually the bureaucrats. They are not professors representing professors for the state, but they are state employees which are keeping the state interest in the universities. So they signed, not everybody, but most of them did sign this support letter for support of the war. Professors attempted to protest. I know at least two cases among people I know very well. One, like Irina Busygin at the Higher School of Economics, wrote a public letter to rector of her university, Higher School of Economics, requesting him to announce that his signature in this letter to support the war was his private initiative. It did not represent the opinion of the university. Of course, he did not react at all. And Irina Busegina was fired soon. She is now in Harvard, fortunately in Davis Center. But that is the way for people who protested. And actually, what happened during the next year or year and a half after this letter and after the beginning of the war, the state regime, came for like everybody who signed this, all 8,000 people, in different forms. And that was a journalist research, journalist investigation. They found that the rectors of the university were forced to fire those people who signed this letter. It was not many of them were arrested. Probably the state did not want to arrest many scholars, while some were arrested. Like Boris Kagarlitsky is now in jail for years because he was. But the first idea of the regime was to force people to immigrate. That was to force people out of Russian academia and to immigrate them to go somewhere outside of the country. And it worked in many cases. Boris Kagarlitsky, whom I mentioned, he was first arrested, then let free. And he was just, obviously he was advised to leave the country. He refused to leave the country. After that he was arrested again, and now he's in jail for many years. So it's an attempt to get rid of all of those vocal protesters, while other people, it does not mean that other people agree with the war, but they are less vocal. And now after seeing what happens with those who could not keep silence, they are even more silent than ever before. So there are several ways from the state to intimidate people. Some people are fired. Some people and fired and could not find a job back in academia in Russia, because if you fired for for different reasons, but everybody understands that they are fired for this signing or protesting against the war. Many people got a label foreign agent. That was a special label, which is the state labeling the critics of the state now without any court decision. But it's a person who is labeled a foreign agent cannot teach. It has a lot of obligations before the state, to report all of the money. It has now restrictions in earning money in Russia, so it's a lot of restrictions for those who are foreign agent. So if person is a foreign agent, he cannot teach at all. And for some people, it was arrest and and in jail. So this was very efficient, very effective form of intimidating the others. And if at the beginning, the first months of the invasion, Russian academia was pretty well. Many people, and at least in my network of acquaintances, like almost 99% probably of my acquaintances or my Facebook friends were against the war. By now, I can guess that the people are still against the war, but they are silent. And this is how that worked. And this is what the state wanted from people, just to keep silent. Maybe you are against the war, but if you are silent and do not protest, you are not part of this protest movement, and it's okay with the state. So intimidation, force into immigration, foreign agent, or arrest is main ways the state influenced people in Russian academia. And that's how I get here. That was one. My case is just a typical case for this last 3 years in Russia. I attempted to stay in Russia and stay vocal. I could not. Well, I decided that I want to stay and continue teaching, but I could not silence myself. Just my personal character. I cannot keep silence. So I decided that I'll stay, and I needed to speak out just because I needed to esteem myself, to keep my dignity, whatever. And because of that, I got several denunciations. At least I know 3 letters was sent to my rector denouncing me for wrong speech. I spoke to wrong journalists. I spoke some wrong things about the state. And finally, rector used this pretext when I was preparing to leave for what I thought would be sabbatical. He just fired me, and this is just. Again, my case is an easy case. I was not intimidated. Some of my colleagues were intimidated, much worse. Another friend of mine who was a chair of the political science department in the St. Petersburg branch of the Russian Academy of Civil Service. He voted in the first days of the war. They have an academic council meeting, and he voted against the resolution to support the war. And immediately after that, he was invited to this director of the branch office, and he was just intimidated. People, he got warnings that he will be arrested next day. That is because of his anti-state behavior. And he left. That is somebody. He shared. Besides the director, some other figure was present, not introduced to him, and he saw that guy was probably from some special services or whatever, but he did not know. Tell him what is it. Okay, that friend of mine now in somewhere in Washington D.C. But it's again, this is a good case for some Russian academic, because of the network. Some of us found ourselves in the Western academia. Some others emigrated to countries like Kazakhstan, Armenia, or whatever, in the close to Russia. But still, it's a big problem. People lose their position, their job, their homes, because they needed to immigrate, and they did not plan to immigrate. Very few of them, probably, of us, probably wanted to immigrate, and many people lost the opportunity to teach, because, of course, any local job market for professors is full, and it's very competitive. So if like 10,000 Russian professors immigrate to another country, where they can find the job. So it's a big, I still follow, we have network, and I see how hard it's for many people to find their ways to survive now. So this is a price that Russian academia paying for Mr. Putin's decision. Again, compared it to what Ukrainians are suffering, it's small one, but compared to the expectation of life, and compare it to the normal life, it's still a big blow. And there are I probably was too talkative, and let me return the floor to Nina.
Well, no, thank you. And yes, of course, compared to what Ukrainians are going through, it's really completely a different scale. But it's an interesting and important topic of itself. Another question, which is really quite different but does relate, is how has Russian academia and the content of what academics, particularly I'd say historians, political scientists, teach, changed over these 3 years? Is there some, I know there's been so much propaganda. How has to what extent has it infiltrated the curriculum? Actually on all levels, including even the littlest children. What's happened to education?
Yeah, thank you. This is an important question. And indeed, the state actually recreated the forms of political influence on the Russian academia. And there are, at least as far as I remember, 3 obligatory courses introduced recently into Russian academia. The course on the traditional values, and some of the courses which used to be taught in Russian academia now banned altogether. Again, I started with traditional values, so that all of the courses on gender studies is now considered impossible in Russian academia. So this course of traditional values was introduced obligatory for freshmen in all the universities. The course which should explain the war, special military operation in the ways that state wants to see. So it's also obligatory. And for the schools, for high schools and for middle schools, there is a special new obligatory classes called the talks about the important things. And that's an official title that talks about important things, and that teachers should somehow explain again the state position on the war. Okay, we know, of course, that not all teachers and not all university professors want to deliver whatever state wants from him, because still we had almost 30 years of relative freedom, and people grew up with that. It's not a Soviet generation, but okay, but many do whatever state requires from them. And we know the cases of like this silent resistance. People use this classes for this lectures for discussing some other topics, but they are probably in most cases they are shy away from criticism toward the war, because they do not know who of the students or parents of the students can denounce them, can send a signal to and we know these cases, that there's such a cases when professors and school teachers were suffered, or were even arrested or fired because they thought some wrong thing in this in classrooms. So that also work. And even when I still was in Russia in 2023, I was invited once to talk at a different university, not on mine, and the organizers told me, our talk will be not irrelevant to of course to war. We will speak about theoretical things, but still be aware. We know that there are students in the audience who report everything that is going on, and we know that in this audience somebody will be present. Not every time they told me, but in this case somebody will be. And that is in my university, by the way, it was not such a way. But my European university was a little small, relatively small, and always had a reputation of liberal. Well, still they fired me. Even such a university could not resist this type of pressure. So this introduction of new courses. Also, what happened, it's happened especially during the last year when I was already in the United States. It's increasing pressure on the universities from the Ministry of Education to somehow to participate in the special military operation, in mastering the occupied territories. So people, the universities need to report how they supported the mastering that. And some of the universities now organize special, send professors to teach at the occupied territories, or some of the universities even organize branches in these occupied territories. Some universities organize like student organizations which help to do, as they call it, the humanitarian help to the Russian soldiers. I mean, they're gathering warm clothes or gathering money to buy some immediate need, and that is also sent to the front line. So they're all forced to participate somehow in the effort of the Russian state to occupy and to continue that. And that's as they specifically want the university to participate. They want everybody to be part of this effort and this is new. This is what increasingly reporting this last year, and that is. So the essence, people who teach, like medieval history, it was like in the Soviet time when I was a student. Historians prefer to choose to make a choice of the medieval or ancient history compared to the modern one or to Russian history, because you can do some scholarship, real research if you do. Not relevant to the current affairs things, but those historians who were studying like 20th century Russian history, of course, were restricted by ideology. And now I see that some people do. Okay, we are philosophers, we are historians of the medieval Europe. We can continue to do what we are doing. We are not. but it's still more and more difficult. And especially, you asked about historians, and especially for historians, because as we all know, Putin is a big fan of history in his own term, and he always produced his own narratives of the past, and it's hard to get in resonance what was he was taking. He can speak about the medieval Russia, and if you are a specialist on medieval Russia, you should either keep silence. And the last thing about the change of the program in September 2023, all the Russian schools received a new rewritten textbook on history. Before that, it was a lot of during the last 2 decades, it was a lot of conversations, change, and competitions for the better textbook of history. But now they received as an order the new textbooks. All of those textbooks are edited under the name of Vladimir Medinsky, and the name Medinsky is somebody probably the most hated among Russian historians person. Medinsky used to be a Russian Minister of Culture. Now he's a presidential advisor on history, and he is not a historian. He is he's a propagandist, and he is a very prolific producer of myth about Russian history, the patriotic myth. So he is now the name of the history textbook.
He plagiarized his doctoral dissertation.
He is, and it was it was a big story about him. Everybody who studied Russian history, recent Russian history, knows his name. And he is now his name like a big insult to all historians.
Yeah. Right. Thank you. Could you add a little bit about for younger children? I mean, I know there's now they've got military patriotic education. I've seen all these photos of children wearing little World War II uniforms and those caps. So what's going to happen to that generation?
Well, there are such big. I don't think. Well, again, I'm already 1 year out of Russia, and it's changed very rapidly, as we know, in the previous years. I do not think that everybody wearing this uniform. Well, some schools or some parents use this as a kind of patriotic education, uses this clauses of the Second World War. But what did happen even before the war, started before the war, and now increased and proliferated, is the creation of so-called youth army, Yun Army.
Oh, yeah.
And this is it's you can say initially it was a kind of an attempt to recreate a Komsomol of the youth communist organization of the Soviet time, but they are much more militarized. They wear in uniform, they have more, and this is for children or teenage, kind of semi-military organization, which many people force all the schools forced to organize such a youth army organizations. So this is part of militarization. And what people who follow all of these changes very clearly see that the state want to re-educate Russian child again in what they call patriotic education, to ban all of the liberal ideas which proliferated in Russia in the previous decades, and to make that few very simple but important points. Patriotism as a state is more important. State interest more important than the interest of the private person, and the Russian interests are, more important than the interest of any neighboring countries, and all of that connected and linked to the heroic past, of course, to the Second World War, to the memory of the great victory over Nazism. So, because the main victory was over Nazism, that everybody outside of Russia probably Nazis, because it's a continuation, All of the wars that Russia held was the wars against Nazism. So if Russia is in war with somebody, that somebody is Nazi. That's work like that, and they continue. And they now, and probably this is also important, the state now uses the veterans of special military operation in schools and the universities. they take some of the people who return from the front line for either mobilized or volunteers for some reasons, maybe after wounded or whatever, return back to civil life. They re-educated and send them to schools. So they teach us now as teachers, of course, this military lessons, military classes, but also patriotic classes. So they want those veterans to be a vehicle of re-educating people. They use, and that is, in some cases, it's really scary because if some of you probably know that during the first, especially during 2022, 2023, for some period of time, one of the major sources of these soldiers were prisons. The person who is imprisoned could sign a contract with army and get rid of his prison terms. And some of them now are teaching in schools as veterans, the former criminals who were educated. And many cases like that are, emerges around Russia. Well, again, I cannot say it's thousands and thousands of people, but at least like few, tens, probably dozens of such cases are reported, and that is scary. And that is scary. That is something. It's actually one of the reasons. Well, from the very beginning, one of the reasons of big immigration from Russia of parents with children. They are very scared to let children to the schools in contemporary Russia because they do not know what they get in the schools. But again, immigration is a choice for somehow privileged. You to travel abroad, you need to know how to travel abroad. Like vast majority of Russians never traveled abroad, and they just cannot immigrate because it's for them it's very out of their imagination, I guess, or out of their resources. They do not have money, do not have passports, whatever. All of that need some, and many people who are probably would immigrate if they have resources, will just needed to stay and to accommodate somehow to this changing environment. But what I can say, which is definitely, people do not want the war. I mean, all of the polls say that people would probably, people would be happy if the war is over, because even those who are like pro-Putin do not want people to be killed. More than 100,000 people killed. I mean, very few people. There are some enthusiasts, but it's very few people who really want to continue the war. But again, this is not a big consolation.
Well, I think surely there are some, even many, who don't want Ukrainians to be killed. And how many people in Russia have relatives in Ukraine and close friends and have been going back and forth? So it must be a very difficult situation.
It is difficult. I do have, and I mean, almost every Russian has somebody. I do have friends in Ukraine. I still hope I do have friends, but it was more and more difficult for me to call even. I have a friend who lives in Odessa. Usually we had talks like twice in a year. On my birthday, on his birthday, we made a call. And during the war, I had more and more difficulty to call him on his birthday because, well, I just read that Odessa was bombed by Russian rocket, by Russian missile or whatever. And I called him and say, Jenny, how are you? And I felt very bad about that. And yes, this is morally situation very unbearable.
Very difficult. And also, I should note that a not insignificant number of those convicts who fought for 6 months and then they came back have committed murders and rapes. I mean, not most of them, but still, right? I remember just after the war. After the invasion, and your Facebook page, I don't remember exactly how long after, maybe immediately after, was and still is this huge sign that in Russian says "Нет войне," no to war. And I thought, how can you be in Russia and have that Facebook page? So, like, how could you have that Facebook page, first of all? And second of all, can that be a segue into asking you something about your own personal story in regard to everything we're talking about, the academic freedom in Russia and the war and so on? Yeah, in the war.
Yeah, thank you. I've already started to share my
I
personal
know,
story.
yeah.
It's actually was a on my Facebook. That was a title of this with that anti-war letter signed by scientists and scholars in the very first day. So I put
No
it
to
on
war.
24th or 25th of February of the same, very few, and it's still there. My feel, especially in the very first days, the feeling was that the majority of Russians are against the war. It's Mr. Putin who started the war, and people, even in the elites, were protesting. So at that moment, people protested massively, and that is why states started to adopt more and more punitive laws, started to get this many years in prison for random people. It was like random repressions, because as far as I understand, too many people were protesting. Putin does not want to make a new gulag with hundreds of thousands or millions of people. He wants to intimidate people and to let the most vocal people to leave the country or to silence themselves. And he's efficient in doing that. He was efficient. But that is why I think that that was a risky thing for me. But it was to keep this Facebook. But at the same time, too many people were doing the same. That is, again, I could not silence myself. And some people still stay in Russia and doing the same. I started this today. This conversation was mentioning this art critic who was detained this morning. Actually, if you open her Facebook, it's still like there. She openly write what she was thinking about war, Putin regime, and she was staying in Russia. But today she was detained, and now that is so. This is always a risk, but it's not immediate. It was not immediate risk. But when I felt intimidation came again randomly. Sometimes we understand why one or another people was arrested because was too vocal or too famous. Sometimes we can just guess or try to guess why this particular person was targeted at that time. One of the big cases of the first year of the war was an arrest of and in jail. Actually, the court decision to jail a famous young poet and theater director Zhenya Berkovich. People start to guess why she was targeted, and somebody found that she wrote some verses. She's a talented poet, and some of her verses were probably too harsh to the eyes or to the minds of authorities, of somebody in authorities. So she was arrested. She is now in jail, and she is in jail for, I don't remember, for many years, and that is for nothing. I mean, it's very hard to get that the people are in jail for doing nothing, actually, not for no, or for words which are never wasn't. It was not a hate speech. It was not anything which. It's just a words which calls like 2 + 2 is 4, and people can go for jail, and that is it. And by the way, I've mentioned Zhenya Berkovich. I have to. Okay, this is a cards with her photo and with a QR code which links to her page. There is a petition there to support. I'll show if anybody of you are interested, you can scan the code and to see. Yeah, please. It's just one of the example, one of the most visible example, because Zhenya is famous. But how many people who are less famous, who were not in the focus of public opinion, are also in jail? We don't know. That's. And yeah, I started to talk my story. So my story is quite short and quite not fortunately fortunately, I'm safe. I'm here, and I'm thankful to Wellesley College for inviting me and for letting me stay in here for well. So my losses are nothing compared to many others. Even in Russia, I do not mention Ukrainians, but even in Russia, people who got in jail is in much worse situation. Well, and I know some people are in jail for lesser worse or lesser deeds that I did. So it's how it worked. Some people get in jail for just one protest, tweet, whatever, or one post in the social network. Well, so that's how it works.
Well, of course, what you said about being jailed for nothing, it reminds me of a conversation that was reported by Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago, in which a guard asked a prisoner, I guess it was probably in a labor camp, what are you in here for? What did you do? And he said, I did nothing. I did absolutely nothing. And the guard said, that's impossible, because your sentence is 25 years, and people who did absolutely nothing get only 10 years. So it's, we're headed in that kind of direction. And the idea that people they're not just jailed, they're jailed for 19 years, 25 years, for these hugely long jail sentences that are reminiscent of the Stalin era. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, well, the difference is the numbers of people. That's new. Well, yeah. The idea of Stalin wanted
scale is different.
Yes, yeah. Stalin wanted to in jail like everybody who could pose, at least for his paranoid type of thinking, who could pose the threat. Putin and his regime want to jail random people to intimidate all the others. It's a different technology, I would say, but it's still. But this how quickly Russia turns to the situation when arrest of the person, detainment and arrest for, even for days, became a like not normal but usual thing. People are arrested for. I don't know. So people are arrested on the first day of any, I don't know, any suspicion arise. Or they are arrested for even for accusation which should not lead to jail at all. People, they are arrested first immediate instead of fined or instead of something. People are arrested. It's a kind of the state want to show its brutality that the state can take your body. Take your body into jail, and this is not just to accuse you, to sentence you to fine or whatever. They want to show the power on your body, and that is why it was arrests, it was searches. That also, that current criminal code in Russia permits the law enforcement to search the housing of witnesses. Not of the accused people, but and that is how it works sometimes. And one of the former students and a friend of mine who's a journalist, he got a search in his house because he is a journalist, published an article in his media about another person who was labeled foreign agent. So he had searched in whole of his house. Right. Well, that is how it works. I mean, the state wants to remind people that they are actually the master of their bodies of their. This is more intimidation, more brutal things. It's not that you can get some consequences, but the consequences was very direct, very like Foucault said in the body politics, and that is part of it.
Right, and I should just add that, of course, the war is affecting people like myself and my colleagues, scholars here. We can't travel to Russia to do archival work. We can't travel to Russia at all. Actually, we can't get visas. The consular sections are closed. And more of our colleagues are named, certain, like an equivalent of foreign agents. They're banned from ever going to Russia again. I mean, my dearest friend, Norman Neymark, who's the Russian historian an East European historian, really more, at Stanford, was devastated that he can't go back. He's been co-authoring something with an 80-year-old, 85-year-old historian in Moscow. So it's really affecting the scholarship. But I think we should now turn to Q&A. We have many students in the audience who probably have questions to pose. So let's move to that. And there's Anna.
Yeah, we're going to use the microphones because of, so it picks up on the video. I'll be quick about it.
Yeah.
Hi there. Yes, thank you for talking to us today and sharing your personal insights. I appreciated that. I guess I have a question. As a Ukrainian here at Wellesley, as someone who cares deeply about Ukraine, their sovereignty, my family members that are still living in the country, do you think that, condemning the war is enough? And I guess that question pertains to how can Russian, academics who are, maybe in the US or diaspora, or even, just the academic field itself, pertaining to Russian studies, etc., work to counter Putin's narratives and propaganda. I guess, what are some ways that you maybe do that in your classes, or ways that you hope to counter what we're seeing in a lot of classes, or just instances in the news, for example, of this propaganda, this imperialist narrative that seems to be infiltrating. And so, I guess that's my question. How are you, or how do you think academics should counter Russian imperialist narratives, maybe through criticizing them or openly to students and exposing them, or rather also supporting Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian history alongside discussions of Russia? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, indeed, there is some of it's probably the major thing. I don't know if it's the only thing that the academics can do, but that's something that Russian academics attempt to do. And I know that several, I did participate in some, and I know much more projects like that, actually, of the Russian academics, mostly now in exile, mostly in the outside of Russia. But still there are some inside of Russia, and they are keeping the names, but still they participate, which are actually targeted exactly on that, on attempting of counter the narrative, to say, to explain what is going on, there is a projects also to counter something to this new textbook. There are several ideas to write like a counter textbook. Well, the books that can be used as a real history, and that such project do exist, and that is one of the ways people try. When it all started, we all felt like. You could believe us that we felt devastated, people, and some people attempted to try how we can help, how can do we cannot stop. We did not stop the war. Well, this is a dictatorship. It was it was already late to go to streets, and people did come to streets, and and people like Navalny just later lost his life. There were several projects which were created to somehow help, to the extent that Russians could do it. I was in St. Petersburg, and St. Petersburg on the border was not far from Finland and Estonia, and that became a hub for Ukrainians who found themselves on the Russian side after the invasion and wanted to get back to Ukraine or to Europe, and that was a big. I know several networks of dozens of people who worked on to help Ukrainians to get back to that was small thing, but people at least looking something to do. A friend of us called us at some point in April, I think, and asking, can you invite the two Ukrainians to your house until they have opportunity to go back. We did like several times, and some friends of us did it like hundreds of times during that. That was one attempt to help, but because of feeling of responsibility and impossibility, and feeling that we cannot overthrow Putin. That is something which we cannot counter to. but yes, it was something which not only academic but many Russians attempted to do. And yes, to counter to the narrative is a major major thing available for people in humanities, for scholars in humanities, and there are such a thing. Also, there is an attempt, several projects to build an alternative educational projects. There are, because the education in Russia became more and more ideologized. There is many projects online. Of online courses, even online colleges and universities. Well, they call themselves universities. It's not, of course, the full university, but this is projects when people in Russian academia, who needed to immigrate, teach online, teach political science, how it should be teaching, history, how it should be teaching, and of course all of the things about Putin's regime and Putin's war and Russia's war against Ukraine. So that is something that Russians, at least this part of Russian academia that I feel that I belong to, are doing that. Well, that is. But yeah, thank you for your question.
Yeah, and I just quickly answer about academics in this country. First of all, right away, the Association for Slavic, Eurasian, and East European Studies came out with a very strong resolution condemning the war. Universities that can afford it, many of them around the country have brought Ukrainian scholars. Wellesley College actually, even I guess last year, the year before, had was supporting Ukrainian graduate students who then came and who made presentations on, this was all online, but supporting them with stipends so that they could do research. In terms of your question about highlighting, foregrounding Ukraine in courses, the number of historians of Ukraine is not very big. And historians of Russia who don't know Ukrainian, who haven't been trained as historians of Ukraine, are not exactly in a position to do proper teaching about a country where they don't know the language and they haven't been trained in the field and don't really know the field that well. So that's kind of that's an issue. Yeah. So
but
plenty of other questions.
Fortunately, we have Sergei Plokhy here.
So
one
I
of the major.
I should announce that March 5th, as I said in my class today, the happiest day for me in the Russian calendar, because it's the anniversary of the death of Stalin. Is March 5th, Sergei Plokhy, who is this country's foremost historian of Ukraine, probably the Western world's foremost historian of Ukraine, will be giving a lecture on nuclear aspects related to the war in Ukraine, March 5th, in this room at the same time at 5 p.m. So I hope you and your friends will all go. The publicity has just gone up today. Yeah, thank you.
What would you say has been the impact of the war and the regime on scientific output from Russia and Ukraine?
Nina mentioned that American scholars were banned to travel to Russia, and Russia. One of the changes which I did not mention in the Russian universities was that Russian universities cut most of its academic, scientific, scholar collaboration with Western universities, and that's actually hit much the research in Russia. Well, they were forced to now. You should collaborate with Chinese scholars. Well, for somebody it works. For many disciplines it does not work at all, and that was a big blow on that. Some people continue to write and to publish even in the Western academia. Some journals refuse to publish Russian scholars. Some others continue to publish. Well, that is. It also depends on the discipline mostly, the output, well, there I do not remember the figures, but I saw these figures. Of course, it's decreased. I mean, all of the that we quantify is became less. Because many people immigrated, and those who immigrated were among the most prolific scholars. They are not in Russia anymore. Many programs were shut down. In my own university, the whole faculty of political science was shut down, and the faculty of sociology was partially shut down because it had a big program on gender studies. It's no more there. So that is the whole disciplines were just cut off, shut down. In some other cases, the major problem was that the collaboration stopped. I know that nuclear physicists are very much concerned. Well, and actually, Western physicists also concerned, but that was a decision that Russians should not participate anymore in the CERN, CERN, this big nuclear project in Switzerland that is like international European, and that like hundreds of Russian physicists did work there. Now they are banned from there. So of course, in the long run, it's a big blow on the Russian science and on Russian research. I've heard an interesting question another day, saying that during the Soviet time, there were mostly scientists who protested against the Soviet regime. People like Sakharov was physicist and not people in the humanities. And now people in the humanities are very active. And the answer was that in the Soviet time, all the humanities were subordinated to ideology. And that is, while now the humanities, during the previous 3 decades, during the actual time of my academic career, the humanities were relatively free. And the new generation of people doing history, sociology, political science, literature studies, humanities and social sciences are, they do know what is real scholarship, real science, real research, and they actually among those who protesting. But again, some of the disciplines were shut down, some others suffered because of the immigration, and another part suffered because of the cut of the links. Well, that is what happened. In the long run, is very bad for Russian sciences. Of course, the people in Russia now tend to compare our situation with Germany. Germany during the middle of the 20th century. Never before. Before the war, Russians, remember the Germans says that, they were enemies. They finally, get during the war, Nazis, and that is. And now people suddenly found themselves as people in Nazi Germany. And the most among the best sellers of the last 3 years in Russia were translations of the memoirs of Germans who lived under Nazi regime. That's the bestseller in people. And I just recollected it because one of the results of the Nazi regime for Germany was the destruction of German science. Before the Second World War, Germany was the leading scientific state, and never since. That what can happen with Russia, and in some disciplines it's already happening.
So you mentioned the new classes being taught in Russian schools. One of them is traditional values. So I'm interested in how students are responding to that. Are they taking in those lessons, and are they really using them? Do they really believe in them? Is that like a popular class option?
Just to summarize for the for the film, the question pertains to sort of the re-education classes of the young and how they are absorbing these lessons.
Yeah, it's a good. It would be good
the
to
one
know.
on traditional values.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, it would be good to know. I do not know. I don't have anybody to ask, but I guess that some people, some students would resist, but not everybody. As usual, in an age when if you are young, if you are elementary school, for instance, pre-teenage, you're usually less critical to what your teacher says. So it's much depend on the teacher. At the university level or in the high school level, it would be different. People sometimes rebel, students rebel against what they are trying to get from the teacher, but again, not everybody rebels. Some more cynical are attempting to make a careers in the new situation. There are always some part of the students who are cynical and who adapt to the situation. They understand that that's a way to get a career, and that happens. So unfortunately, I cannot give you figures what was the portion of each of those. I do know. In my former university, more people were critical, but again, this was a special case. European University in St. Petersburg always had a reputation of.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that too, because Sophia and Isabella was in my first year seminar on Putin, and we did really learn that There is a significant minority in Russia that is decidedly homophobic. And so I would think maybe the more sophisticated university students would resist, I mean, just resist the idea that they would have to be indoctrinated with traditional values. But I don't think we should assume that the Russian young people have the same sensibilities entirely that we find in our own milieu here at Wellesley.
I can,
liberal university. No, right?
Can I well,
You would get
argue?
disagree?
Yes, you know,
Right.
if I don't know if you follow this Eurovision contest, you know, this popular song. Back in 25 years ago, in 2001, the Russian group represented Russia, Tattoo, you know, TATU, which actually pretended they did not actually, but they pretend to be lesbian, and nobody in Russia attacked them or criticized them. The Russian society 20 years ago was more tolerant of what is. I mean, this is like how state came and forced people to develop homophobia, while people, young people 20 years ago was not homophobic at all. So it's all you know, imposed by the
Right,
state.
and I guess we got our data from the poll, from the Levada poll, from the polls, and we had a lecture by Professor Cassidy from Williams, you know, in the earlier in the fall, talking about this. So it's there in the polls.
Yeah, but again, I guess that there are like homophobic minority
Right.
here in the United States as well, but they are
Yeah.
they're less vocal because
yeah.
but in the case American state will support homophobia, I guess that people will be more vocal here. I mean this is about the state society are still responsive to what the state is.
Yeah.
You know, you now can witness how some of the reaction of Americans changing with the change of president, and Trump is not Putin. But Putin is 25 years already in power, and he imposed his visions for 25 years. He had all of the state apparatus in his hands, and of course, it's already worked.
Yeah.
But you know, it's some portions of the society are just looking at some situation they will be silent, and some other situation they
Right.
go ahead.
Right.
So it's homophobia, racism, and all of these bad things do exist, and the difference is, are they exist in a closet, or the people are proud to be homophobic, racist,
No,
or
I
whatever.
think they're not. Right. Yeah. Right.
I wonder what the reaction of the Russian Orthodox Church has been, and whether they've been able, whether they feel free, like our Episcopal bishop who made a statement, to speak out one way or the other, pro or
About the war?
Yeah, if they've
Yeah.
been able to.
So can I just
Glad
do
you
a
asked that
summary?
question.
The question pertains to the reaction of the Russian Orthodox Church.
Yeah, Russian Orthodox Church, the official church, I would say, is in line with the state position. It's a long tradition. You know, Russian Orthodox Church was subordinated to state before the revolution, and it is now getting really relatively quickly under the state, under the state propaganda umbrella. Because of that, actually, the Russian Orthodox, this official Russian Orthodox Church suffered a lot on Ukraine, because before the war, it was probably more Ukrainians who attended Russian, were the parishes of Russian Orthodox Church than in Russia. As Ukraine is more religious, more Orthodox country than Russia was. And now, of course, it's almost gone for Ukraine. But it also brought some pretty significant portion of Russian Orthodox priests to split with the Russian Orthodox Church. We have at least two, maybe more new like churches, Orthodox churches, which are just created relatively recently, or were reinforced relatively recently with people who defected from the official church because they did not want a part of that, or some of them did not want to defect, but the Patriarch Kirill, fired them, and they found themselves in this Russian Apostolic Church. They call actually there is a Russian Orthodox Church in America. Well, don't remember exactly the name, but it's one of them. So this is a split within Russian Orthodox Church. But the official one is never was a opposition force to the state. It's always.
The Patriarch called the church the war a holy war. Putin anointed to wage this war. It's really very different from the bishop, and the Episcopal bishop in Washington. Absolutely different.
So I heard the question about how Russian academia can support Ukraine and how they can help to stop this. But I was really curious about how international academia, international scholar society, can prevent Russian academia fall and support all this rebirth of Russian scholarship. Can you comment on that?
Could you repeat the last part?
So
The rebirth of what?
How international international scholar society can help Russian academia come back on its legs and like be independent again. As you commented before, that now Russian academia, like Russian scholars, moved abroad. And
You mean the Russians abroad to be independent?
yeah, like how
Because
international scholar society can help Russians come back on a field and be competitive in academia.
So the question is
yeah.
how international scholars can help Russian academics come back into the field and be competitive.
Yeah.
Well, you can, to get back, we need first to get Russia without Putin and Russia without this regime. That time it will be that will be something I can advise to how the Russian academia was. Until that, it's more or less the Russian academia in exile, or Russian academia is in hiding back in Russia, and that is at least the radical solutions of the first year, when some Western academics just refuse to talk to Russian academics, even those who anti-Putin, it's gone. People now, as far as I can witness, I can see, people in the Western academia no more refuse to speak to Russians. I mean, those Russians who definitely against anti-Putin, and that is already a good development, because, with all of the responsibility of, state responsibility for what is going on, not all the Russian academic personally are, so much responsible or whatever, and that is a big help already. But I don't know what to advise to Western academia as a whole. Maybe Nina can say something.
Well, I mean, right. So, I mean, to help Russian scholars be more independent, those who are in Russia, is impossible. I think Professor Kurilla is an example of an American university that is providing a way for a distinguished and prolific Russian historian to do his work. Many universities are doing what they can to help Russian academics. Many universities are doing what they can do to help Ukrainian academics. We'll see what happens with this new administration about how universities that are losing a lot of funding will be able to support, at least from the United States. I'm sorry, but I'm just not that well aware of what, for example, European universities are doing to support Russian and Ukrainian scholars. I don't know that much about it.
So we are officially over time. I know that there are a few people who still have questions for Professor Kurilla, so feel free to come up and talk to him afterwards and continue the conversation. But for now, please join me in thanking both Professor Kurilla and Professor Tumarkin.